Through you, Mr. Mayor, I can confirm that we are live.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special council meeting on May 9th, 2022. Beginning March 1st, 2022, the City of Kitchener has aligned with provincial changes to COVID-19 restrictions, and City Hall is now open for in-person services, but appointments are still being encouraged. The city remains committed to the safety of our patrons and staff and continues to facilitate electronic meeting participation for members of the public. Those people interested in participating in future meetings can register to participate electronically by completing the online delegation registration form at www.kitchener.ca/delegation or via email at delegation@kitchener.ca. For those who are interested in accessing the meeting, something just happened to my screen. For those who are interested in accessing the meeting live stream video, it is available at kitchener.ca/watchnow. Before we begin today's meeting, I'd like to remind everyone that this afternoon we're gathering on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We recognize our collective responsibility to serve as stewards for the land and honor the original caretakers who came before us. Our community is enriched by the enduring knowledge and deep-rooted traditions of the diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Kitchener today. We're now going to proceed with the delegations as listed on the agenda for the strategic session reports. I'd like to remind all delegations of some guidelines for participation. You'll be made a panelist prior to your name being called. Once you have joined the meeting as a panelist, you'll have access to your microphone camera. Please leave your video camera turned off and your microphone audio muted until you are called upon to speak. If you conduct yourself in any of the following manners, it will result in an immediate removal from the meeting, interrupting councillor, staff, or other delegations, derogatory statements about members of council, staff, or others, turning your camera on at inappropriate times, or any hate speech or defamatory comments. One last reminder for delegations, please do not take offense if following your presentation there are no questions from council. This is council's time to really listen and reflect upon the opinions and ideas shared with us from our community members. Today's delegations are really all part of a presentation. And so we have with us Catherine Dever, Director of Strategic and Corporate Performance, Judy Stevens-Wells, the Chair of Compass Kitchener Advisory Committee, and Jody Shanoff from Environics Research. Others in attendance include Angie Fritch-Walters, our Strategic Plan Engagement Program Manager, Tim Poselt, Stephen Davies, and Randy Sod from Refocus. And with that, I would now like to turn it over to Catherine to get things going.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. And I'm really excited to be meeting with members of council today. It's a key milestone in our strategic planning process. So when we last met with you at a strategic session on March 28th, we overviewed the whole spectrum of the strategic plan process and our innovations in working with the Refocus team and applying their enterprise evolution methodology to the process this time around. So a resident survey has always been a key foundation for strategic plan engagement to identify community priorities for each term of council and each strategic plan four-year cycle. So we're really excited today to hear the results from Environics and discuss those with you, and to get council's leadership and direction around the specific areas you'd like staff to explore in the next phases of engagement. And you will see us again, just to preview, on August 22nd at your next strategic session of council to discuss the community priorities for the next strategic plan. Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic.
Well, thank you very much for that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Judy Stevens-Wells to get things going from a Compass Kitchener point of view. Judy.
Good afternoon, Mayor Urbanovic and members of council. It's a pleasure to be back again. My report for you today is a very short one. I wanted to give you a little update. In early April, Compass Kitchener received draft results from the public survey and spent some time at the April meeting reflecting on the responses two questions in that survey. We focused on really four areas: the responses around sustainability, recreation, arts and culture, the most important local issue in improving the city, and lastly, public engagement. Then on Friday last, Compass Kitchener received the final version of the public survey report. We have been and will continue to work with city staff on development of the public engagement process to further refine understanding of the key issues faced by citizens in Kitchener and the priorities that they feel need to be addressed. On May the 4th, Compass Kitchener organized a meeting of all the chairs and vice chairs of all of the city's advisory committees. And that meeting provided us with an opportunity for dialogue with advisory committee members to get their input in a couple of areas. One was to get input from them on the public engagement process that we'll see unfolding over the next few months. And the second was to introduce them to the donut model that Refocus is working with and gather people's feedback with respect to that model and how it might be personalized to be most useful in the Kitchener context. Looking ahead, Compass Kitchener will be looking at the results of the survey alongside the input that we receive over the next number of months with respect to public engagement processes in order to provide a report to council in August outlining Compass Kitchener's recommendations of the strategic priorities to be addressed in the new strategic plan. And I think that's all I have to share with you today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Judy, for that overview and the work that the committee's done thus far. I'll just, as always, on behalf of council, thank you and the committee members for your ongoing work and efforts. And in many ways on this piece, it's just starting out again, because we've got the whole piece of work around engaging with the public and digging deeper. That's going to happen. So that's kind of exciting. With that, then, we will now turn it over to Jody Shanoff from Environics, who will actually provide their presentation.
Thank you very much,
Jody.
Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I have to admit, I'm not clear if there's a presentation loaded or I can share my screen. And there we go. My question is answered. So thank you very much for that. So it is my pleasure to be here on behalf of Environics Research to present the results from the 2022 public survey. This was our third opportunity to partner with the city to collect this information and share it back with you as part of the strategic planning process. The questions, the metrics are focused on different aspects of citizen satisfaction. We'll go through some of those and expectations when it comes to planning for the future, according to Kitchener residents. There is, of course, a full report that goes into quite a bit of detail. What I'll focus on for today's presentation are the key insights, the highlights from the results. But of course, the Environics team is always happy to be available in the future for clarification beyond what we've discussed today or what's seen in the report. So I'll move to the next slide, please. So just to sum up in terms of methodology, because this is always a really, really important piece of the work. So it's not just about the questions that we ask, but who we ask them of and how we ask them. So we were pleased to partner with the Refocus team this year as part of this research. And as in previous years, this research was conducted using a telephone methodology, computer-assisted telephone interviews. That's, of course, with the live interviewer, rather than using any online panels or anything like that. So we divided our sample up between landline and cell phone only households to make sure we got a good distribution across the city using that telephone methodology. We were in field towards the end of March, mid to late March and early April. That's very similar to waves in the past. from a seasonal perspective, that sometimes can make a difference. In total, we spoke with just over 1,000 Kitchener residents. It's a representative sample. I'll spend a little more time talking about sample composition in a slide or two. And when we use a telephone methodology like we did here, the results that we have can be interpreted using a margin of error. And in the case of a sample of this size, we're looking at plus or minus 3.1 percentage points. 19 times out of 20, we'll get the same results. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that this year's survey differed from previous years, in particular because of its focus on diversity and equity and inclusion. And Kitchener is not alone in wanting to make sure that data and any efforts reaching out to citizens happen in a way that that promote and recognize the diversity of the community. So that was definitely a thought in the foreground of the design and the execution of this year's survey. So it was implemented in a few different ways. This survey, compared to other years, included new questions that capture aspects of the diversity in the community, including ethnicity, gender identity, so different questions that we hadn't probed on before from a demographic standpoint. So making sure that we welcome and recognize those demographic realities within the community. We had an increased reliance in this survey on that cell phone landline 50-50. You're just not finding a diverse population when you go landline only. On the telephone. So that's another method that ensured that we were able to reach out to a far more diverse group of Kitchener residents. And making sure that we keep the survey manageable to a manageable time frame. People are willing to set aside, in this case, it was about 12 minutes of their time that we took to get them through these questions in a way that was welcoming, and we could accommodate people who wanted to be part of this research. So that's a lot of the effort that went into this wave of research, ensuring that the data that you got in response is rigorous and it is representative of the population across the community. The next slide gives us a little more detail so we can see how that was achieved. When we set up any kind of survey, we always want to focus and make sure those bigger demographics get captured in a way that's representative. So whether it's gender, and of course this year, as is the case with most public sector research that we do, making sure we're going beyond just male and female, that we're capturing the diversity of the gender spectrum. And we were able to do so here in a way that we feel is representative, certainly of what's happening in Kitchener and what we're learning from the release of Stats Canada Census 2021 data as well. Making sure we've got a good diversity of age groups. It isn't on this slide, but we've also made sure it's well represented across the 10 wards of the city and that we haven't overrepresented any areas. And of course, reaching out to make sure that we capture that diversity of ethnicity that is present across Kitchener, giving you a sense here of what we were aiming for, and through our best efforts and balancing the various objectives of the study, including a timeline and budget. We felt quite good about how we were able to reach some of these very small groups, but important groups within the community. So these tables give you a good sense of what we were able to achieve. And then of course, as is typical in the market research space, we apply weighting to the data once we've collected all of our interviews. I refer to it as kind of smoothing the wrinkles in the data. We want to keep weighting to a minimum, but ultimately that's how we get to a representative view of the population. So wanted to reassure everybody that significant efforts were taken this year to ensure that was the case with the data. So we'll get into the top findings then on the next slide. So top issues this year compared to previous years when we've conducted this research together look quite different. probably not surprisingly. I will point out that while we've used the language of affordable housing here, in fact, the reference is more to the affordability of housing. It's a broader cost of living, and in particular, the cost of housing, whether it's purchasing, even rental. And this is a trend that is prevalent across the country, frankly, and increasingly so in urban centers across the country. And we see that result is up quite significantly from the 9% we saw back in 2018. But I will remark, having gone back to that data, that even in 2018, that result had gone up 7 points from when it was previously measured in 2013. So that's an issue. I don't think I'm surprising anybody by suggesting that's been on the rise for many, many years. And we seem to be in a real crisis these days in terms of hearing across the country about concerns about cost of living, and in particular, the cost of housing. Where we saw some other changes, public services and transportation, whereas that had featured very prominently in the data back in 2018, has come down quite significantly. We don't ask people to explain, and we don't get into specifics, but what I'll suggest is 2018 certainly was right before LRT operation in the region, and so transportation would have been top of mind certainly for residents at that time, and a reason that we would have seen that result there. I'm sorry, I'll pause for a moment and just ask. I noticed that Councillor Singh has a hand up. I'm happy to take questions, or I can wait until I'm through the presentation and then come back for questions. I'm not sure how, Your Worship, how you'd like to handle questions at this stage.
I think unless, Councillor Singh, unless it's urgent, I think I'm inclined to let you go through the presentation and then go with questions at the end. Is that okay?
It's not urgent at all. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. All right, happy to proceed to the next slide. So just further on that point about the affordability of housing again, and recognizing, and both of those issues that I referenced previously, of course, we all know those are regional. Well, in the case of where affordable housing refers to social housing, and certainly transportation, those are regional issues. Respondents won't always make that distinction, of course, when there's something that they're concerned about. And that's the case here, certainly, as we continue looking at the data, asking what are the changes that Kitchener can make to make it a better place. And again, that issue of housing affordability and roads and transportation right up near the top of people's concerns and expectations. I'll also point out that homelessness and poverty factors into a lot of the data that we saw this year in the Kitchener study, ranking higher than it did in previous years. So just something to note as we look through the results and understand what residents told us. Next slide, please. So satisfaction is relatively stable from when it was last measured about 4 years ago. Not a lot of movement there, and that's consistent with things that we're seeing in other municipalities, certainly. Lots of blips up and down over the course of the pandemic and lockdowns and closures and uncertainty. But all in all, evening out and coming out with a fairly significant proportion. So in this case, 78% who report that they are satisfied with the city. And we typically see that level of satisfaction is highest among younger residents. And that also correlates with residents who are newer to the city as well. You'll often find that relationship goes hand in hand. Next slide, please. Similarly, relatively stable, a little bit of a softening, but we're still looking at almost 2/3 of Kitchener residents who feel the government's on the right track, on the right track when it comes to addressing issues in the community. Similar to what we're seeing in other municipalities as well, bumps up and down as citizens have dealt with the uncertainty of the pandemic, with a little bit of softening. And I will say, as we should be hearing that affordability and cost of living music in the background, certainly as we interpret these results, because we'll see in subsequent slides, and something that we see in general contributes to the balance of right track, wrong track responses, some concerns when it comes to overall affordability, and that citizens feel that decisions are being made in the interest of addressing their greatest concerns. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest changes we saw in the data where we were able to track from 2018 to this year was in the perceptions of value for tax dollars. So in response for the services that residents are receiving, do they feel as though they're achieving good value? I look at the very good number to see to diagnose the extent to which there is a difference or a softening. And in fact, it's down 10 points from 2018. And we see in evidence in other slides in the full report, not in this presentation, but where we're talking about taxation and understanding resident appetite for whether taxes are held at the rate of inflation to maintain services, or whether they are maintained and cutting services. There's been a real decline in the overall appetite to increase taxes at the rate of inflation and maintain services, because in general, people are having difficulty affording the cost of living. So there's been a real decline overall in people's tolerance for increasing at the perception even of the costs, and subsequently the kind of value that they're receiving for their taxes. So that is reflected in the result that we have here. Next slide, please. Overall, similar results to 2018 when it comes to residents commenting on how well the city does when it comes to communicating about how tax dollars are spent, but we're not at all surprised to see that it's declined slightly, because as residents are likely to be critical of the value that they receive for their tax dollars, they're also likely to be critical of the extent to which these things are communicated to them. They go hand in hand. Next slide, please. So turning to issues that were not tracked, so particular to the 2022 wave of research, and issues that I understand were the focus of Compass Kitchener. When we get into speaking about sustainability, here we see that a very significant proportion of the population, almost 3 in 5, agree that it's important to be using more of the city's, the city's budget to address climate change. This is something that we are seeing across the country. This is a reflection of the kind of observations that Canadians are making when we see flooding of the Toronto Islands, when we see the kind of environmental events that have happened out in BC. It's not at all surprising that significant proportions of populations in urban centers across the country they have climate change on their minds and wondering to what extent infrastructure and just planning is taking into consideration the impacts of climate change. So we were not at all surprised to see this result. Next slide, please. Thinking about changes over time and what residents think is important to be considered. Certainly when talking about sustainable development, that is one of the priorities. These were prompted items for respondents as opposed to them offering them open-ended. So they're really split, Kitchener residents, in terms of placing priority on focusing on sustainable development within the city versus protecting natural resources and agriculture. So that's certainly where their priorities seem to lie. Less important, providing unique spaces in the city and a range of diverse transportation choices. Although notably there, younger residents put some emphasis on that notion of being able to travel around more easily and through different sources. Next slide, please. Turning to arts and culture, residents were asked open-ended, so top of mind for them, what would make Kitchener Arts and Culture even better than it is now. And by and large, residents offered the idea of events, different types of events, but that's certainly from a retail standpoint, one of the things that residents notice the most and certainly prioritize in terms of things that could add to the culture and the arts, the vibrancy of arts in Kitchener. Similarly, on the culture and recreational front, in a subsequent question, which again is available in the detailed report, residents are keen to see an emphasis on programming that focuses on mental health and well-being. That's something that we see quite a bit of in any kind of municipal feedback about services, and a focus on vulnerable populations as well, making sure those populations are being accounted for and programmed for in city planning. Next slide, please. When it comes to considering options about economic development, whether it's about emphasis on existing businesses that may have been impacted by COVID, or supporting the creation of new jobs, perhaps not surprisingly, residents want to see council balance the approach to those two priorities. So the preference is to take care of everybody and everything. A little bit of emphasis on the on making sure the businesses that were impacted by COVID, the existing businesses, are looked after, but to whatever extent possible, on council, residents are asking that both new jobs and existing businesses are taken into consideration in economic development planning. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide from the highlights of the report, and this one focuses on public engagement. There's a relatively significant number of residents who indicate that they're motivated to participate in planning. We see about 58% overall who express that motivation. But it's important to notice, to balance that out with a sentiment, or something I might even characterize as a bit of a concern, that the perception is quite low among residents that if they do provide feedback, that it will have an influence on decisions that are made. So in that case, we only see about 22% of residents who feel as though there's an impact from the feedback that they provide through public consultation. So an important thing to note for councillors and for people engaging with residents, that they want to know that their efforts and their interests are being reflected in the decisions that are being made. So those are the highlights. I'm very happy to take any questions through you, Mr. Mayor, and address any, provide any additional clarity on the data here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jody, for the presentation, and clearly lots of interesting data, lots to unpack there. A lot of really positive and encouraging data, particularly when I compare it to some stuff that you know I've seen sort of in the media as of late. And when I get to my turn of questions, I'll ask about that. But I also see that many of my colleagues have questions. So let's get those going and take it from there. And we'll start with Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like you, you know, some of the details shown was as expected and some surprising. Jody, you know, how do we compare nationally amongst the municipalities, or even through Ontario? That's a good reflection of how we're doing. If the issues are across the board, or if they're more specific to our community, that helps us guide a bit better. You mentioned on some, but the analysis and the report that we provided to staff, will that have some greater data sets that can help us compare ourselves?
Mr. Mayor, through you, Councillor, thank you for the question. Every municipality has its own unique nuances, and certainly while I've tried to signal some of the things that are pervasive across the country. Again, the issue, the cost of living and the affordability of housing right now, that is the same no matter where you're looking. Again, I'm speaking from an urban center standpoint. To the extent that municipalities will have issues that are particular to what's occurring, those will come through in the data. And we saw, for example, shifts in Kitchener where transportation, public transit, for example, doesn't factor as high as it did in the past when it was a concern among residents. Public transit remains high in the GTA, for example, by comparison. That remains on people's radars and often close to the top. To the extent that COVID has created all kinds of questions and uncertainty, we've seen that in different ways coming through in municipal data. It ranks quite low in Kitchener compared to other municipalities where we've seen that concern be a little bit higher. And so that may speak to communications and just how the pandemic has been handled in Kitchener compared to other municipalities. So we really—
I was trying to be like focusing a little bit on perception, right, of how residents feel. Again, some of the questions were depending on their satisfaction with local government, as well as how they feel, what they're getting for their tax dollars. Those were two specific questions. I wanted to get a better idea. Are we getting something wrong in comparison to overall sentiment that's being felt across the board, or are we doing something better in comparison, right? So those the others that you mentioned are quite evident that it's an issue across, but the two questions that I asked, do you see any difference in those?
I wouldn't say so, Mr. Mayor, through you. On satisfaction, I'd say Kitchener is very much on par, and I'll compare in particular in Ontario and the GTA to try to keep things more local, very much on par with what we've been seeing in other municipalities, and taking into consideration when we're comparing single-tier municipalities to two-tier municipalities, that also always plays a role in there. But I wouldn't say that Kitchener has stood out as either particularly problematic or knocking it out of the park compared to other. That's been a very steady result for Kitchener. Further on the value for taxes, Kitchener may be slightly lower than what I've been seeing, but everybody's down at this point in the cycle as well for what I would term those small E environmental factors, that perception of the cost of living and overall affordability, in particular of housing. Everybody's struggling with managing that perception right now, and it's pulling down that perception of the value for taxes.
Guide us to focus on where we can perhaps try to communicate better. So there's a sense of understanding as well. Just with my very short time that's left, if you can quickly go back to the slide where early on it showed, the aspects of concern, and there was one that ranked very high about affordable housing. And then a couple items down, it mentioned homelessness and social housing.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see that? When we're talking about affordable housing or affordability is a question, a lot of times the initial sentiment gets relied on as a lower tier municipalities having to answer questions or make decisions regarding jurisdiction that's not necessarily ours, or make avail resources from a taxation point of view, which we don't necessarily have the dollars for, comparison to affordability of housing overall. Are those two very distinguishable items that we're hearing from this and guiding us of what we need to be focusing on? Aspect of affordable housing related to policy setting, or towards specifically outlining resources?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I will. The affordability of housing. Well, when residents answer these questions, they don't likely get as nuanced and detailed as people in the setting of city council will, and think specifically about policies. This is a reflection of the thing that keeps me up at night and that I'm worried about either for me or my family and my loved ones. So the affordability of my housing situation is literally about how much it costs me, and not necessarily thinking about any specific policies. And I'm trying to make the distinction. You mentioned as well the reduction in homelessness and poverty being a concern, and homelessness and poverty in general. Definitely people making a distinction between those two. Again, not necessarily aware of the level of jurisdiction responsible for addressing those things, but in the context of a survey being asked, what are my concerns? These are my concerns. And to the extent that the pandemic revealed significant fissures in social services and people falling through the cracks, that mention has soared in our public sector work, in particular in urban centers, and people noticing homelessness and poverty to a much greater extent than they did previously. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thanks, thanks, Jody. We'll move on then to Councillor Michaud, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Jody. This was a great, very interesting presentation, and as Mayor Benedict said, a lot to unpack. And also, I'll spend more time with it later and review it. But the one question I'm perplexed about is the public participation with city planning. Do you? And I don't know if you can answer this. Do you suspect that COVID and the way we have public meetings has kind of guided that number and the perception that or the feeling of residents not making a difference, being able to make a difference in their feedback to planning?
Thank you for the question, through you, Mr. Mayor. The pandemic and the change to how we come together and discuss things has had a significant impact on public engagement. In some ways, being able to connect virtually, and I don't have to leave my home, and I don't have to find a babysitter, and all of those kind of considerations have made it more accessible for many, but for others, it has made it difficult. If I don't have access to a computer at home, if I don't have secure internet, now there are barriers to my ability to do that. Whereas previously, if I knew it was in a rec center gym, I could just go and find it. So it's definitely impacted how people are able to engage. And ultimately, and this is generally true about public participation as well, the people who really want to be part of it will be. The people who are really motivated by it. And I would caution, when you look at those numbers, I would focus on the top box as opposed to the top two, because those people who say, I'm somewhat interested, or I have a moderate amount of interest, are probably not going to put in the effort required to be part of public participation. There's interest there. It's definitely become complicated for people to get engaged and not see the follow through of their engagement and what impacts that can have down the road in decision making.
Okay, right. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks very much, Councillor Michaud. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic. And Jody, what a great presentation for somebody who loved research methodology, not the stats part, but the research methodology. This is really cool. So thank you so much for preparing this report. And as the Mayor said, and Councillor Michaud, there's certainly a lot to unpack here. It's interesting to me that 69% of residents are wanting help for businesses. So that's actually really great to see, and really good information for us to be sharing with our chambers and that as well, and see how we can be working together to help those people. I'm wondering, I mean, the overall issue about affordability in terms of housing and that, and looking at the snapshot of time when you did this too. I mean, in our community, we have a large encampment. So this was between March 13th and April 4th, I think you said. Yeah, or March 18th and April 4th. I think that is top of mind for a lot of people. The affordability piece. I'm wondering, I think that that's something that spans all age gaps here. I think there was only one piece where you actually pointed out an age gap, and that was on the younger people wanting more transportation choices. I think that's the only place where you had pointed that out. Did you see significant differences in ages? Because I see that 52% of residents are over 50 that were in this study. So it was pretty even. But I'm wondering if there was large age gaps in any area.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for the question. And almost never am I asked a question by someone who introduces themselves as interested in methodology. So thank you for that. That was lovely. Methodology is key. It doesn't matter. It's like you can't interpret what you have if you don't know who provided it.
Garbage
So,
in, garbage out, Jody.
Yeah. It all rests on the rigor of your sample.
Okay.
So in the larger report is where we go into more detail about different demographic differences as they stand out as statistically significant in the data. So where the data would have told us it was statistically significantly different, we point that out in the narrative. And if it's not there, then we don't. And when it's an issue that has media coverage, even if it's for a brief period of time, like something like dealing with an encampment, that will be something that will permeate all age groups. That won't be particular to different demographics. So while there was definitely evidence in the data for younger people being more attuned to some of those social issues, it wasn't always consistent in terms of them standing out. Other ages in the data noticed many of those issues to the same and pointed them out as concerns to the same extent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jody.
My pleasure.
And I can attest that Councillor Johnson isn't just feeding you a line. I do recall how much she loved this stuff in university. Moving on to Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Jody. I have a question about slide number 9, where we talk about, so the top line is affordable housing. So I have a couple questions. And you said that, well, really it's about housing affordability. So when people were, the question that's there, question number 1, what were the the respondents actually seeing? Affordable housing or housing affordability? Because I mean, it's not necessarily the same, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Councillor. So respondents didn't see anything because they were interviewed on the telephone. So that's one thing. And that was an open-ended question that they were asked in terms of what was their top concern. I'm just trying to look exactly for the wording so I can be accurate with that. The single most important local issue facing the city of Kitchener today. So they would not have been prompted with a response. They would have had the option to offer a response that's top of mind. And then after the fact, those answers would be coded together wherever there was a theme. So it was kind of at the discretion of the coders. And I acknowledge that it's unfortunate language, that it's about housing affordability and not affordable housing, because I appreciate the implications of the affordable housing in the context of two-tier municipality. But we also have a very extensive list of the verbatim comments that were offered by respondents, and they tend to be comments like, housing is unaffordable in my city, in my area, in my community. Housing is expensive. Those types of responses offered top of mind, coded together under that heading.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was to do with that same slide. You've grouped roads and urban development into one. I just wonder, and I noticed in a later slide way down, like 28 or something, I forget what number it was, but they were separated out. Like, so what are we actually looking at here? What do roads and urban development mean?
That is more a focus on references to infrastructure. So whether it's building projects or road construction projects, those were the ones that would be grouped together there.
So it could be any type of development it could be a new road, or it could be just repairing roads, or?
Correct. Any reference to roads and construction would find its way there into that code. Otherwise, if we don't group some of these, the list becomes very long and unwieldy, and it's hard to see the themes and the trends. But again, we do have a very extensive list of the verbatim comments, and so it is possible to look at them and parse them apart. I'm aware, for example, that on roads and urban development, it was mentioned quite frequently in one of the wards. One of the ward 4 stood out significantly on this particular item of people giving that particular mention. So we're able to go back into the verbatim comments and look to see what were the comments there. But again, they tend to be very generic and just references to construction, road construction, building construction, causing a problem in my community or being noteworthy in my community.
Okay, one last question, if I may, is just, do you have a breakdown of by wards of all of these categories? Like you've mentioned 9 and 10 in the housing affordability one in Ward 4 and the other. But do you have any further ward breakdowns?
The ward breakdowns are available in the data set. Again, as with questions about age groups, we only call them out in a report when they're statistically significantly different. So when they stand out from others or from the population on the whole is when we will call them out. Otherwise, they're treated as similar to what residents in general are saying on these particular issues.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Councillor Chapman. Councillor Schneider, you're up next.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks so much, Jody. I love pouring through this too. As a guy that loves to research, just love it. What I'm seeing, when I look at slide 49, it's kind of an encapsulation of what we're dealing with the social issue of affordable housing, and then the practical issues that we do more of in a city, like better roads and transportation. From what you've seen here, are you seeing more of an interest in our citizens in looking after more of the things like social issue items?
Thank you very much for the question, Councillor. Yeah, I would say back to my earlier comment about the impacts of the pandemic and the extent to which we have become far more aware of where certain populations were at a significant disadvantage and fell even further through cracks as a result of the impacts of the pandemic. Those issues have definitely risen in the minds of, in particular, urban residents across the country, where it's easier to come across an encampment than in other settings in the country. So those things are definitely top of mind. I would also add that if we're talking under the social heading, and to the extent that the instruction this year for this survey was to ensure the representativeness and be in a position to capture data that's far more inclusive and representative than it has been in the past, using terminology that recognizes different identities. It's on the top of all of our minds, and it can only be reflected in the data that we're collecting now. So definitely those things have risen in consideration. I would still suggest, and I think the data backs us up here, that at the end of the day, but those issues that impact me and my pocketbook are the ones that we're going to see right at the top of the list. So how much it costs for me to get up every day and go about my business and keep my family fed. we're still going to see those at the top, but those other issues have ranked on lists where we just haven't seen it in the past necessarily.
Okay, thanks very much, because I know it's, I think, all of us on council want to do our part with social and with affordable housing. I think the city's been, great with doing what we've done for a Better 10 City and land for the YW's project, and we're looking at doing more. It's just, as you say, you pointed out too, there's a little bit of confusion as to, the jurisdiction of who does what. So I think that's important to maybe find ways of how we can get that out. I don't know if that can come out in any further research, but I find that's an issue too when we, my engagement with citizens. But thanks, this is great. I can't wait to pour through it.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Schneider, and you raise a good point there, and that's part of the work that Compass Kitchener and our staff will be doing as they sort of dig deeper between now and ultimately when the report comes back to the new council, to really understand what some of these things mean, and jurisdictional issues will no doubt be part of that. Councillor Ioannidis, you're up next.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic, and thanks, Jody, for your presentation. I guess for me, it's no surprise that we're seeing the social issues that are coming up. But to me, what I find rather the most surprising to me is when it comes to the majority that feel that they get good value for their taxes has waned since 2018. And the biggest portion I see is in the growth of the fair section of that slide. And so my feeling on that is, could that possibly be influenced by the way the pandemic has rolled out, with the way governments, like higher level governments like the province and the federal government, when they provided programs for the pandemic, how much do you feel that sentiment may have factored in on this one?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor, for the question. So there are so many factors that go into a shift like the one that we're seeing on that particular item. And certainly public spending throughout the pandemic, we've seen that be an issue of concern and a question among Canadians everywhere. The affordability of all of the spending that went on during the pandemic to keep the economy and to keep people employed. So no doubt that's likely a factor. Again, I think my interpretation and from looking at other data as well, the softening is also in large part impacted by perceptions of overall affordability of living. And so my view of the value I derive from all kinds of things that I spend money on, as that money becomes more precious and scarce, the perceived value becomes far more focused as well. And to the extent that residents may not know, I'm paying taxes and it's not always clear to me what I get in return for paying those taxes. And there's only so much money in my bank account to go around. That's going to impact ultimately how I perceive the kind of value that I'm getting when I pay my tax bill. So my sense is that the affordability piece is a significant contributor to the shift in this perception. But again, so many items like the ones that you've mentioned that are also at play, without digging into it specifically with respondents, which is not where we wanted to spend the time in this survey. It's difficult to tell, but I think those are very significant contributors to why we've seen a softening, not just in Kitchener, but in other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, because I really find it surprising, because financially overall, we've managed to, compared to many other municipalities, and here locally, we've managed to have our taxes significantly a lot lower than others, and still increase our services. So to me, sentiment's it's not heavily correlating as much as I think it should. But
understood.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ioannidis. Colleagues, we have two more people with questions, Councillor Marsh and myself, and then we will be moving on to the discussion question that's part of this strategic session, and that's, as a reminder, based on the community survey results, what would you like to learn more about from citizens through the next phase of engagement? So once we're done with questions from Councillor Marsh and myself, we'll move on to that. So if folks want to think about that, if you haven't already, and I'll turn the floor to you, Councillor Marsh.
Thanks very much. And thanks for bringing this presentation to us, Jody. I want to hone in on something that Councillor Johnson brought up. Another person interested in data, and I'm wondering about, you've disaggregated some of the data just around an age category. The younger ages 18 to 34 are looking, they're more likely to say that providing diverse range of transportation choices is important, but certainly there must have been other data that was interesting when you disaggregate it. And I'm just wondering if a follow-up, look could be done to help us better understand who's saying what.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm starting to believe that we're way over indexing in this group on people who claim to like data and statistics, and this has been the best part of my day. I don't spend a lot of time with people who make that claim, so thank you for that. Yeah, so obviously in this presentation, I've really stripped down the data so that we could talk about the highlights. The report has much greater detail, again, where demographic groups stand out as statistically significantly different from others in holding some of these opinions. You'll see that in the larger report. And then this is where you prove your mettle that you really are into data, because then there are the crosstabs, reams and reams of Excel spreadsheets where, so it's our job, and we comb through those, and where the results stand out to us as worthy of bringing to the attention of council.
That's fine. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just, I get that you've only highlighted one or two, but I'm just wondering if the larger report with all of the more detailed levels of data are going to be provided to us or to our staff at least.
Yes, all of that data is the property of the City of Kitchener, so that is provided.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And then back in 2000, I believe it was 2007, was the first time that the City of Kitchener contracted Environics to do a huge study. And then it was expensive. And so we said, oh, should we do it again? But we wanted to use the benchmarks back then to have comparators in 2009, and then again 2013, etc. And I'm just wondering, do you have you had a look back at that wealth of data that we now have to, and I understand some of the questions have changed, but and so they should, but and again, not for this audience, not for right now. I'm just interested to know if we can have a high-level comparator between 2007 and all the other dates till now to see what has shifted, because we're looking now towards another 20-year plan.
Thank you. Sorry, I've just taken note of that, Councillor. I've written it down. It's absolutely possible to go back. We did not, for the purposes of this study, we felt back to 2013, would give us a decent trend line in terms of on those items that have been repeated over the 3 waves of research. But we can definitely look back to 2007 and see if there are some other trends or data points that we can bring in to help round out the story, taking us into 2022.
I just think it would help us understand how things have shifted, and then be aware of what has remained the same, so that we can, understand that going forward. So thank you very much. And I'm sorry for geeking out on the data, but I do think it's not just those who have admitted that they're interested. I think most of us are. And so if we can get a little more detail by email or something, that would be helpful. Thanks.
We'll take a look back. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Marsh. Jody, I have a few questions, some of which have been asked and some maybe that I'll just dig into a little deeper. Just going back, and some of these are just sort of curiosity around methodology as well. In terms of the online cell phone portion, I guess as you're going through and calling people, if you've sort of reached your residents with landlines, you sort of stop asking them and simply ask those who are cell phone only. Is that sort of the approach that you take?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, we set goals for the different, based on what we know about the distribution of the population. We set goals for, and that would be based on what we know about the penetration of cell phone only households. So we'll start with those harder targets, and certainly cell phones can be a little more complicated than landlines. When you're dealing with a 519 exchange, for example, that covers a pretty broad area. So we have to do a little more work to be able to focus that just in the Kitchener area. But yes, we will focus on those groups. And then if it's becoming onerous and slowing down the field, we'll communicate with our clients and say, we got 49% cell phone. Are you okay if we just do 51 landline, for example, and then wait the data later? But yes, that's we would have started with the cell phone sample there before we reverted to the landline contact.
Okay. Gotcha. On the diversity piece, I noticed, with, for example, visible like people of color, we got to 18%, but they represent 27%. We got to 78% of those who identify as Caucasian, but they represent 70%. I'm just wondering, like, there's still a gap there. Mm-hmm. And is there more that we could or should be doing in order to try to make it even more reflective of the community?
So every methodology to engage with residents will have upsides and downsides and barriers to being as representative as you might hope to be. And we always have to balance, like I suggested earlier, the extent to which we stay in the field, making phone calls to try to find one more West Asian participant to give us feedback and answer our survey. So we monitor that, and we always say best efforts to achieve the representation that we know is ideal for activities like this. It's my understanding that as part of the strategic planning process in Kitchener and subsequent engagement conversations that you're planning to have, that other methodologies are being considered to also reach out and engage with different communities across Kitchener, and that is what is ideal ultimately. That not all methodologies are well tailored to every person to get engaged. So the more channels and doors you can provide for residents who want to be part of a discussion, the better off you are in terms of getting to that final representative state that you feel comfortable with. We were very pleased with the diversity that's reflected here, and where it was tough to get some groups, we got as close as we could. And it reflects a pretty significant improvement over previous years, only because we collected the information to know where we were at in terms of representing diversity, whereas in previous waves that was not something that was required.
For sure. Thank you. Two more questions on the satisfaction number. And this is one that I have found interesting because I saw not that long ago one by one of your competitor firms. I saw it on LinkedIn. And I mean, I'll mention it because it's publicly out there. It was Polera, and they had said that 55% of Canadians expressed overall satisfaction with their municipal government, a decline of 15 points from 2020. I found that really interesting in comparison to our number, because our satisfaction numbers seem to stay fairly even with last time around at 78%. Whereas, I mean, obviously different surveys, different methodologies, potentially, but similar kind of question. And so I was surprised by that difference. And I'm wondering if you just have any thoughts on that in terms of the work that you do with other municipalities and some of those comparators.
Thank you for the question. I'm always going to be very careful about commenting on other data that I'm not familiar with the Polera data. I'm not familiar with the question, the seasonality of when it was collected, the exact wording. So I'll be careful about, Kitchener has had a consistently very healthy citizen satisfaction result, and has maintained it over the time. We're comparing here a 2022 result to a 2018. I don't know what citizen satisfaction looked like in Kitchener in the depths of COVID and lockdowns. I know I saw in the GTA where we were doing research that there were definitely blips and fluctuations during that time as Canadians expressed frustration with all levels of government and concern and just a lack of certainty that would impact how they were feeling. But certainly from what we've seen and maintaining the question wording and the seasonality of when we ask questions, we've seen Kitchener maintain a pretty consistent and very healthy level of citizen satisfaction.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And then the last question is on the value piece. Is it possible that part of the reason we've seen the decline in value is because, quite frankly, people haven't been able to use municipal services in the same way the last couple of years, right? I mean, we've had to, facilities have been closed because of COVID. We had to do some things differently, particularly in year one around some of our outdoor maintenance and so on. And we got some feedback in that we fixed in year two. So is it possible that some of that value question may be influenced by that?
I think that's absolutely a very valid interpretation, that goes into the mix of looking at these results. And I think there are other results in the survey that would also support that, whether it was the results I cited earlier about a lack of appetite to sustain an increase in taxes at the rate of inflation to maintain services. So that's fallen right off compared to what we'd seen in 2018. And further, a real emphasis from residents this time around when it comes to all residents paying for all of the paying for services and programming through general tax revenues, as opposed to user paying services and fees in the past, where we've seen less of an interest in the general tax revenues. People are interested in let's spread that pain around, and as things are not available in a consistent manner that we've been accustomed to in the past, and people can make those choices about library and recreation and all the things they've been accustomed to. People seem to be asking for a more equitable way, a fairer way to address that. So it's not, it doesn't have any undue consequences for a particular group of residents.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions I have. Unless you have any closing comments, I think I would say thank you to you for your presentation and for taking all of council's questions. And oh, sorry, Councillor Davey, you have your hand up before I wrap it up and move to the question that we have to deal with as a council.
Yeah, apologies. I was actually going to answer that question, but I would actually, since you give me the opportunity, just ask that one question, if I could, that Jody just touched upon. The biggest change that struck me was that graph in terms of I don't think it was in your presentation, but the delivering services with taxation, where delivering rate of inflation and maintaining services sort of fell off of a cliff. And I'm just wanted to get and like, I think I take some comfort in the fact that it sort of equally went both towards people that want to see more services, higher taxes, and people that want to see fewer services, less taxes. So I think we're still in the right place. But do you think it's more what the mayor had just spoke about in terms of not seeing services for a couple of years? Because I was assuming, or you should never assume in stats, but I assumed it would be more so tied to the affordability issue that folks are struggling with. So was there anything that would point to one or the other in any of the research that we did?
Thank you for the question. I wouldn't say definitively one way or the other. The other thing that's part of that question that I didn't emphasize, but is the I word, and using the term inflation today, asking these questions compared to asking questions with the word inflation in them years ago, when it wasn't nearly as high as it is today, also impacts how people are answering these questions and what they're willing to tolerate. So again, I can't stop hearing the background music of affordability. That's certainly that something is always on our minds when we're interpreting this data, and think plays a large role in how people are considering the value they receive for taxes, for example, and other services. But to the mayor's point, not having access to certain services for an extended period of time has to factor in there somewhere. Without having asked people directly to quantify that for us, it's logical that would be part of the consideration as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you again, Jody, and no doubt we'll probably cross paths again. But in the meantime, you've given us lots of great data to review and reflect on in the weeks and months ahead.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And the team is here if there are any further questions or follow-ups. Very happy to be of assistance there.
Wonderful. So with that, colleagues, we'll now move into the question that we have. And I would invite any feedback, and the feedback would certainly help staff as well as Compass Kitchener in terms of the kinds of things you'd like to see them dig more into in the coming months. So who would like to provide any thoughts or reflections on that? Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And there's a few matters that are top of mind. I think our staff are already undertaking very important work in relation to the city's tree canopy review. I think getting a better understanding the level of either restrictions or enforcement that may be required to preserve that city assets. The other is in relation to intensification citywide. That or either the expense of growing outward as a city outside of suburban boundaries and into our green areas, and jeopardizing more natural resources when it comes to agriculture, because that was some of the feedback that we received through the environments. And the other thing is in relation to our parks. That's extensive body of work that's being undertaken right now. I think a better understanding of are we investing enough in our neighborhood parks across the city so that we have equitable sense of investment into our communities across the city, as opposed to a more specific focus of investment into district parks, rather investment across the board. And the last thing in my mind would be ongoing feedback from our community in relation to trails and transportation. The importance of trails that serve connectivity of our neighborhoods, especially into the next term of council. Many members of this council and previous council have spoken continually regarding the importance of investing in year-round connectivity of our communities through our trails network. How much more should we carry that work on, or how quickly should we accelerate that work on? Getting feedback on that would serve well, especially because it's been of importance to many members of council present in.
Thanks, Councillor Singh. I got what you were saying, but I know some were struggling to hear a little bit. I don't know if there's an issue with your mic or if there's something in front of it or what it might be, but maybe you can also, just to make sure that staff captured it, also just flip them in an email. Those 4 points that you made, that would be great.
I can do that. And if people want to answer back if Councillor Singh should upgrade his internet account, that could be a good answer as well. So.
Absolutely. You've been encouraged to do that over the last 2 years. Councillor Davey.
Yeah, I'll be brief because just in general, I think a lot of things that Councillor Singh touched upon is what I'm interested in as well. Is really I'd like to get a little bit more about how we're doing in what I would just sort of call our core services. Like this is a lot of the big picture things, housing affordability, that sort of thing. But I'm also interested to know how people think we're doing with respect to things like, uneven sidewalks and filling potholes and cutting grass and the parks as well, right? Like, are there enough amenities, playground equipment, et cetera, in the parks that we have? So, this, I get that they can't really do that stuff in a survey, but when we're going and digging deeper, I would like to find out whether we need to be investing more in, I guess, what we already have.
Sounds good. Thank you, Councillor Davey. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you. I have concerns with the public engagement and the question about how people feel that whether they've influenced city decisions or not. So I'd like to dig deeper into this because the numbers are pretty high. 39 and 30% feel that a small amount of what their comments were taken into consideration, and 30 not at all. So I find those numbers pretty problematic, and I'd like to learn more. I don't know how you go about that, but I think we need to take those figures seriously and try and understand them.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Chapman. Councillor Johnson.
Yes, thank you. I think one thing we need to keep in mind, and again, when they did this survey was between March 18th and April 4th. And in that period of time, as we continue we're really being hit with inflation at the moment. And I think if this survey had been done, 6 months earlier, that the results would have been different. So I don't know what we do in terms of kind of reading into those results, but I think it is important to consider the snapshot of time that we're in. And I would agree with Councillor Davey. I know that I'm just waiting that soon I'll be getting some emails from Westmount residents because the boulevards haven't been cut and there's dandelions all over them, and I just want to go over there with my own lawnmower sometimes and deal with it. But I haven't yet. Don't worry. But I know that we're just about to hear about some of those very, very common things that really do get on people's nerves. And again, they've been staring at, they haven't been able to leave their homes for a couple of years. So they've been, that high grass becomes even more of an issue. And I think as well, the fact that, over the past couple of years, for every job that we did, we had to send 2 trucks to 2 separate things, even though there was only 2 people going to it. They couldn't ride together in their vehicles. There was so many things during COVID, I think, that where people didn't understand. And when I would explain to them, here's why things are taking a little bit longer in terms of our outdoor work, they would go, oh, I hadn't thought about people not being able to be in cars together. So I'm wondering if these results are skewed. Absolutely, we need to be concerned about them. But going back to what Councillor Davey said, is there a way paring down and looking more at, is it about the things that you've always been able to count on, those certain services that didn't happen the way that you would have liked them to for the past 2 years, really kind of skewed their thoughts on the services that we're providing.
Okay, thank you. And I'll be turning to Angie at the end of all of our feedback to sort of give a bit of a wrap-up comment, particularly from a engagement perspective going forward. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief here. I'd like to maybe get like a slice of pie comparison illustration of where our citizens want us to invest. Is it more core services? Is it more social issues? You know, get an idea of where their priorities are on that. If there's a, you know, ability to know that, I think that'd be great. I also would love to know a little bit more about expectations in engagement. We do ask for engagement, and sometimes there are two sides on an issue, and they're absolute, and sometimes our decision takes a little bit of both. But if one's, you know, one on one side didn't get completely everything they wanted, they say, well, you didn't listen to me. So it's how do we balance, how do we educate to say the engagement was all heard, the opinions were all heard, it was all put together, and here's what was decided. That would be great for me. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Schneider. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I really think that we need to focus on the core services and finding out with a priority list of what's important to the community, with affordability being one of the biggest pieces that's important to the community. I think we need to look at, with inflation being so high, there may be areas that need to be cut, and I think having that priority list of what important core services are prioritized within the community would be an important piece of information to have.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Galloway-Seelock. Councillor Ioannidis.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Urbanovic. And yeah, I agree with Councillor Galloway-Seelock and her opinion, and what Councillor Davey and everyone else is mentioning with dealing with the core services and what we can really look at. But one other portion that I forgot to bring this up in our last delegation, which is it's dealing with transportation in general. And I'm wondering if we could have a little bit of more clarity on that position, because, you know, as we see in the Environics study, transportation dropped from 2018 as a public services, transportation dropped from 2018 to 26% to 4%. But then when you go into the next slide, better roads and transportation, they want to see more affordable and better roads to make a better place. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And I think we need to be a little bit focused a little bit more on there, because I think that's, and I know that's been a focus for many residents for many years. So I just want to get a better sense of where that's at.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ioannidis. Councillor Michaud.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Everything's pretty much been said. I'm just going to kind of reiterate, go back to Councillor Chapman's comment of what I brought up earlier with regards to public engagement. I am concerned about that, and I'd like a deeper dive in, as Councillor Chapman said, but also Councillor Schneider, you know, made a comment of the expectations, what citizens' expectations are. So I think both of those pieces need to come together, because that is, you're absolutely right, Councillor Schneider, with, you know, you have public meetings. If people don't hear what they want to hear, then we weren't listening to them. So it needs to be a fair, kind of a fair, rounded findings, I guess, to put it. So I would like to see more of that in the public engagement.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Michaud. Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, I like a lot of what I'm hearing. I agree. It's very concerning that people feel that when they engage, they take the time to engage, that they don't feel heard. It's not surprising to me, because I I have heard that a fair bit, especially when decisions are made that people engaged on, but it didn't go the way they wanted it to. So let's look into how can we better communicate our decisions. I want to know also, what do people think we should be doing differently when it comes to the core services? Yes, let's focus on what do people prioritize about our core services, but perhaps we're not providing enough or providing them in a specific way. For example, perhaps we need to be providing more green spaces within more neighborhoods. And perhaps we need to be making sure, everybody wants, a lot of people are focused on climate change. So perhaps some of the city services need to be provided in, electric vehicles rather than the traditional ones, that type of thing. I want to understand better, how do people see, our opportunities for improving how we provide our services. And I do want to give a shout out to our communications team. I do think that we do a good job of communicating. I just think that maybe we need to do a better job of reaching the people that don't feel that we're communicating properly. Because I think we're doing a great job. Maybe we just need to get a broader reach.
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. Any other feedback? Okay, if not, I'll just add mine into the mix. And I would echo many of the comments that have been shared by colleagues. I think, in particular on things like the housing affordability / homelessness / poverty issues, I think, trying to dig deeper and understanding, where people see our role versus the regional role versus the role of provincial and federal governments and others is going to be key. I think on the issue of tax value and so on, understanding why we've seen a little bit of the shift there. I suspect it was for some of the reasons I asked in my question earlier, but I think digging into that a little deeper would be helpful. I would echo Councillor Marsh's comments that I think our communication area does a great job. But I think what we're seeing here is to a certain degree a real desire for us to do even more and find those ways, as has been pointed out, to even connect with folks even more so, because being able to have good quality, trustworthy information, particularly in a world where social media is not always helpful on that front, quite frankly, is extremely important. And so I think that's something we probably want to explore. On the issue of climate change, I think for me it was interesting that we've seen, really some fairly high indicators around the dollars we should be investing in this area. Because in the past, we haven't always seen that. We've seen the environment and sustainability as a priority, but when it came to actually spending the money, that number was lower. And notionally, at least, it seems that there's support around that. I would echo the comments around digging deeper and understanding some of the comments around citizen engagement. And I think part of what we need to explore there is what are the expectations from the community around citizen engagement, and then exploring how we might be able to better deliver on those expectations, because it does require a balance. And maybe part of what we need to do a better job of doing is also helping people understand how the information they provide fits into the overall decision-making process and the work that both staff do and that ultimately council do in considering various issues. Lastly, I think an area of interest to me is particularly recreation, arts, and culture, and just some of the numbers around mental health and well-being, services for vulnerable populations, physical health and fitness, and so on. I think there's some really interesting data here potentially that speaks to work that we need to be doing in our community centers and other facilities, and it starts asking some real questions around what role do our neighborhood associations play in that versus what role does the city need to play in some of this stuff, because fundamentally there's programming here that may not align always with work that volunteer groups have the skill sets to deliver on, and where we may need to turn to partners, and so I think those are areas that we're going to need to explore some more going forward. So those would be my comments, and with that, I want to thank everyone for their input and turn it over to you, Angie, for some wrap-up comments.
Thank you very much, Mayor and members of council, for your questions and your feedback. We're very excited to dig into this data further with residents and understand in more detail what they meant by many of the questions that you've raised around core services and how that fits in with our overall planning, expectations around engagement and how we can ensure that residents know how their input is being used and what their expectations are around how that's shared back with them. As well, we'll dig in a little bit more around taxation and how people would like to have input in the decision making around more or less services, and what impact inflation and that scary number that's out there right now around inflation is impacting their decision making and their responses to some of these questions. So thanks very much. We will be working diligently over the next number of months to dig into this information further, and look forward to coming back to council with Judy and Compass Kitchener in August to outline the community priorities based on that additional feedback from the community.
Wonderful. Thanks a bunch, Angie. And I guess that's it for this item. Thank you to everyone who was involved, from staff to Environics to our Compass Kitchener folks. Very informative session. So with that, folks, we'll move on to in camera, and there's a motion to go in camera for the items listed, moved by Councillor Ionetta, second by Councillor Chapman. Councillor Gazzola.
Yes, I'm questioning why the first item on the agenda for caucus is being dealt with in caucus as opposed to as part of a public meeting. The report we received from staff, in the report itself, it states that it's important that we are transparent about next steps regarding this issue. And yet here we are dealing with it in caucus. I would like to move that this issue be tabled and left until May 30th, when it can be fully discussed at an open public meeting. I'd like to move that recommendation.
Okay, so Councillor Gazzola, as you know, the normal procedure is to move that to go into caucus, and that has been moved and seconded. You are now moving a contrary motion. You can certainly vote against it going into caucus, and urge others to do so. One of the actions coming out of caucus may in fact be to deal with a component of that, depending on the direction of council, to deal with that in a public session. And that would, that's commonplace, as you're aware, where there are items that are dealt with in caucus, and then the part in caucus is dealt with there, and an item then comes forward in public session as appropriate.
So what did you say in all that?
So what I'm saying in
I'm
all that,
not, I'm trying to remove the one issue. The second item that's on the agenda for caucus is a legitimate caucus item and should carry on. So I'm just trying to remove one item. I'm not trying to stop the caucus meeting.
right. So Councillor Gazzola, what I will do is I will separate the two. You can certainly, and any member of council can vote in favor or against going into caucus. The reason it's in caucus is identified in the agenda and the report, and then it's up to council to decide if they deem that appropriate. So I will.
Well, I'd like a recorded vote if you are going to take a vote.
Okay, I will do that. So I'll deal with item number 1 in a recorded vote, and I'll start with Ward 1, Councillor Davey.
I'm in favor.
Ward 2, Councillor Schneider.
In favor.
Ward 3, Councillor Gazzola.
Opposed.
Ward 4, Councillor Michaud.
In favor?
Ward 5, Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
In favor?
Ward 6, Councillor Singh. Ward 8, Councillor Ioannidis.
In favor.
Ward 9, Councillor Chapman.
If I say I'm opposed, that means that I want it to be public, right?
Well, no, if you're opposed, it means it won't be dealt, you're suggesting it wouldn't be dealt with in caucus, as I've indicated, as is normal practice. Items in caucus often get dealt with in public after staff have had the opportunity to give us the in-camera information.
Okay, so I'm opposed.
Okay, and Ward 10, Councillor Marsh.
In favor.
Okay, and I'm in favor as well. Councillor Johnson?
You missed me. I'm in favor.
I'm sorry, I lost track of my count. Councillor Johnson.
In favor.
Okay, thank you. The second item, Councillor Gazzola, did you want that recorded vote as well?
No, there's no necessity to do a recorded vote on that. No.
Okay, so those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. So I will then deal with a motion to adjourn. Those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And we will just wait until we end the live streaming and get the right people in the room, and then we'll go from there.